She woke up to silence, no alarms, no street noise, no familiar creaks of her tiny apartment. Instead, the air smelled faintly of sandalwood and something else, clean, expensive, untouched. Chloe stirred, her head pounding and mouth dry as she opened her eyes. The light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows blinded her for a moment. She blinked, confused. This wasn't her bed. The sheets beneath her were satin, crisp and warm. The bed frame was oversized, carved wood with clean lines and dark polish. She looked around. Modern furniture, soft gray tones, abstract paintings on the walls. A skyline spread beyond the windows, glittering under the early morning sun. Her breath caught when she looked down. She was wearing nothing but a towel, loosely tucked around her chest, her clothes nowhere in sight. Her shoes were in a neat pile near a velvet armchair. Her dress, purse, and even her bra were folded and laid carefully on a side table. She sat up, slowly, her heart pounding with questions. How did she get here? The last thing she remembered was the tequila, her first shot ever. She had let her best friend talk her into going to that bachelorette party, just one night out, one drink, one dance. She had agreed reluctantly. It had been her first real outing in months. She hadn't expected to black out. She stepped off the bed and wrapped the towel tighter around her. Her legs trembled, not from fear, exactly, but from the weight of not knowing. Her body didn't hurt, she didn't feel violated, but that didn't mean she wasn't in danger. She padded quietly across the room, searching for a door. The moment she stepped into the hallway, she stopped short. A man stood by a sleek kitchen island, his back to her, pouring hot water over coffee grounds. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with calm precision. His hair was dark and neatly styled, and he wore a plain white shirt and gray slacks. He turned around slowly, as if he had known she was watching. Their eyes met. He looked even more unreal in the light, sharp jaw, pale blue eyes, and a kind of quiet power that made her stomach twist. He didn't look surprised. His gaze was steady, measured. "You're awake," he said calmly. Chloe tightened the towel around her and took a step back, her voice caught in her throat. "What happened?" she asked, barely above a whisper. "You passed out in the restroom of the rooftop bar." He picked up a second coffee mug and walked toward her. "You were alone. No friends in sight, no phone in your bag. I asked the manager if I could take you somewhere safe." He handed her the cup. "I figured this was safer than a hospital waiting room." She hesitated, eyes darting between the cup and his face. "You didn't do anything." His jaw tightened just slightly. "No, I took off your wet clothes and put you to bed. That's it. Everything's there, clean and folded. You were freezing. I gave you space." Chloe's cheeks flushed. 1,000 thoughts swirled in her mind, but none formed clearly enough to say aloud. "Thank you," she managed, staring into the coffee. He nodded once, turned away, and said nothing else. She didn't know his name. She didn't know why he'd helped her. But as she looked around the penthouse, because that's what this had to be, she realized one thing. Whoever this man was, he didn't live in her world. And yet, last night, her life had crossed paths with his in the most vulnerable, accidental way possible. She took a small sip of the coffee, her fingers trembling, and for a moment she didn't feel afraid, just out of place, like a book on the wrong shelf. Chloe stood in the elevator, her clothes finally back on, her heart still unsettled as the doors slid shut behind her. The ride down from the top floor felt surreal, each second pulling her farther away from the strange, quiet man who had saved her from a mistake she couldn't even remember making. Her fingers clutched the paper cup he had handed her, the coffee lukewarm now but still grounding her in a moment that felt too big to understand. Back in the gray drizzle of downtown, she walked fast, her cheeks hot with confusion and embarrassment. It wasn't just the fact that she had woken up in a stranger's penthouse wearing nothing but a towel. It was that he hadn't done what she feared most. He hadn't taken advantage, hadn't looked at her with expectation or pity. He had only offered coffee, said little, and let her leave without questions. That unsettled her more than anything. Her apartment was 3 blocks away, tucked between a rundown dry cleaner and a noodle shop. She climbed the narrow stairs quickly, unlocked her door, and stepped inside the small studio she called home. The space was tight and quiet, a bookshelf covered in worn paperbacks, a desk cluttered with note cards and a half-open laptop. A single framed photo of her and her grandmother sat beside a potted plant wilting in the corner. She changed into sweats, tied her hair up, and dropped onto her small couch. The events of the morning rushing back in pieces: tequila, noise, the rooftop bar, then nothing. Her head throbbed again. She had never been drunk before, never even wanted to be. The night had been a favor to her friend from work, a final celebration before she moved out of state. Chloe had gone out of guilt, one drink, they had said, just one. She hadn't expected the rooftop to be so beautiful, all glass and lights, music humming under her feet. She remembered standing by the edge, watching the skyline blur through the fog. And then she remembered hands, someone catching her elbow as she stumbled in heels she borrowed. A voice, low and calm, asking if she was okay. She didn't remember if that had been him, the man from this morning, but it might have been. That night faded into the next day, and life moved on. Chloe returned to her routine, morning shifts at the school library, 2 nights a week volunteering at the senior center, weekends working part-time at a bookstore near the train station. Her life was ordinary, structured, safe. She liked it that way, no surprises, no expectations. Until the surprise returned. A week later, she was helping a student scan textbooks at the library front desk when a clipboard was placed gently in front of her. She looked up and froze. Standing there in a gray coat and scarf was the man from the Penthouse. Taller than she remembered, his eyes calm, focused, not entirely cold. "Hello again," he said. "I believe we've met." She blinked, trying to find her voice. "Yes," she said quietly, her fingers tightening on the counter edge. "I'm here about the new digital archives project," he said. "My company is helping the school implement it. We're just doing some early coordination visits. I didn't know you worked here." Neither did I, she thought, but she only nodded. Her chest tight, she stepped out from behind the desk, the clipboard still in her hand. "I'm Chloe," she said simply. "Ethan," he replied, though she hadn't asked, his voice softer than it had been that morning, like he was speaking to someone fragile. She led him down the hall, into the back office, her mind spinning with questions. She had imagined this moment all week, rehearsed it in her head, but none of those imagined versions had prepared her for the quiet reality of his presence in this dull, fluorescent-lit building. They walked the halls slowly. He asked her about the library. She answered plainly, each word cautious, measured. She still didn't know what he wanted or why he was here, but he didn't press, just listened. At the end of the tour, he paused by the staff bulletin board, glancing at the faded flyers, then turned to her. "Would you let me buy you coffee?" he asked. It was a strange moment. Not flirtatious, not demanding, just honest. She hesitated. Her instinct told her no, but something in his voice reminded her of how he had looked at her that morning, not like a man with power, but like someone trying not to scare something small and afraid. "Maybe," she said, "not today, but maybe." He nodded, no pressure, just gratitude. Then he left, leaving behind his name, his voice, and 1,000 new questions. Chloe tried to return to normal, or at least pretend that she had, but normal had shifted. Her days moved in the same rhythm, the same familiar steps through narrow halls and soft pages. But now, behind every task, behind every conversation, there was the echo of his voice, the memory of his apartment, the calm in his eyes when she expected judgment. Ethan was not someone she could easily forget, not because of what happened, but because of what hadn't. He hadn't looked at her like she owed him anything, and that confused her more than she liked to admit. The next time they saw each other was not accidental. He returned to the library 3 days later, this time with 2 other people, dressed in darker colors, both carrying tablets. They looked official, efficient, like people who made decisions and expected the world to move accordingly. Ethan didn't say much that time, only nodded politely when he saw her, but his eyes lingered a second too long, and Chloe felt her stomach twist again, not in fear, but something stranger, quieter, something close to curiosity, and something dangerously close to wanting. That night, she sat in bed with her laptop open but unread. Her phone buzzed once, a message from an unknown number. "Thank you for the tour last week. I would still like to buy you that coffee. No pressure. If not..." She stared at the screen for a long time, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. She didn't know how he had found her number, maybe through the school files, maybe from someone on staff. But the message was simple, respectful. Like him, she typed and deleted twice before replying. "Okay, but only if it's near the library. I don't have much time this week." The response came almost immediately. "There's a place 2 blocks down, Wednesday at 4, I'll wait." That Wednesday was cold and gray, the kind of afternoon that made the sky look like steel. Chloe wrapped herself in a thick sweater and told herself it was just coffee, not a date, not a decision, just a meeting. She spotted him before she reached the cafe, standing outside with his hands in his pockets, his coat sharp and neat against the dull street behind him. He looked like a scene from a different film, something expensive and still. She almost turned back, almost let the fear win. But then he looked up and smiled, not wide, not forced, just enough. Inside the cafe, he asked about her work and her life, about the students she helped and the books she loved, and she found herself answering, not with guarded half-truths, but with real pieces of herself. Not all of it, but enough to feel seen. She asked about his company and he told her little, brushing it aside like it didn't matter. "I inherited most of it," he said, "but I'm trying to make it matter. We do a lot with education now, funding access, digitizing collections. Libraries are under threat. I'd like to keep them alive." She didn't know why that made her chest ache, but it did. They talked until the light outside faded, until the cafe filled with the quiet clatter of dishes being stacked. He walked her back to the library without asking, not too close, not too far, his presence calm and steady. "Thank you," she said as they reached the steps. He didn't ask for anything more, didn't push, just nodded and said, "Anytime." After that, he came around more often, not just for library business, but with donations, meetings, proposals for community programs. Always professional, always poised, but he would glance her way when he thought she wasn't looking, and sometimes she let him think she hadn't noticed, but she always did, and part of her waited for those moments. She didn't know when it happened, but his presence stopped feeling like an interruption and started feeling like a thread, something woven into her week, something quiet and steady and beginning to matter. The shift came slowly, like warmth creeping into a room after winter. They had coffee twice more, always at the same corner shop, always on neutral ground, and each time he asked more questions, not about her past, but about her hopes, her ideas, her quiet belief that maybe things could be different. Maybe kindness wasn't weakness, maybe structure wasn't a cage. He never made her feel small for dreaming, and she never felt like she had to earn his attention with anything other than honesty. That was new and terrifying. Then one afternoon, he asked her something different. "Would you ever want to see the city from above? I mean really above, not just rooftops." He said it with a lightness that tried to hide the question underneath. She tilted her head and smiled. "I live on the 3rd floor. That's already a stretch." He chuckled and nodded. "Fair enough, but the offer stands." 2 weeks later, she said yes. The elevator to his penthouse felt taller this time, less foreign, though still impossible. When the doors opened, she stepped into the same quiet world she had woken up in weeks ago, except now she was awake and choosing it, not lost in the fog of tequila and fear. He poured her tea this time, not coffee, and showed her the view again. "You were half asleep when you first saw it," he said. "Figured I'd give you a better look." She stood by the window, watching the city pulse with life below. "It looks softer from up here," she said. He nodded. "It's easier to believe in things when you're far enough away to dream." They sat and talked, not about business or books this time, but about why she loved old stories, why he hated empty praise, why both of them believed in second chances even if they didn't say it directly. She laughed more than she expected, and he listened like every word held weight. When she stood to leave, he walked her to the elevator again, but this time, just before the doors closed, he reached out and handed her a small wrapped package. "Something for your bookshelf," he said, and then the doors slid shut. At home, she opened it slowly. It was a first edition of a novel her grandmother used to read aloud to her, weathered but beautiful. Inside the cover was a note in his handwriting. "Thought you might want to remember how stories start." Chloe stared at the note for a long time, her fingers pressed to the page. She didn't know what this was, what they were building, if anything, but it felt like the beginning of something real, something that didn't demand, didn't rush, something with roots. And for the first time in years, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, a heart like hers could belong somewhere unexpected. Chloe stood in the bookstore where she worked on weekends, her fingers trailing along the spines of old novels, as her thoughts drifted again to Ethan. It had been nearly a month since that afternoon in his penthouse, and though nothing had been said outright, something between them had shifted. It was in the way he looked at her, like he saw past everything she tried to keep hidden, in the way her phone would buzz late at night with a simple message about a book he thought she'd love, or an article he wanted her opinion on. It was subtle and slow, like a breeze curling under a locked window, and she wasn't sure when she stopped trying to close it. He never pressed for more than she was willing to give. Not her time, not her story, not her trust. He was patient, and she hated how rare that felt. The world she came from was small and certain and cautious. Her grandmother had raised her with care and with fear of losing too much, of giving too much, of trusting too much. Chloe had internalized those rules without realizing it until now. Ethan never made her feel wrong for it. He never made her feel like she had to perform or pretend. Instead, he just kept showing up like someone trying to prove that some doors were worth opening if they were opened slowly enough. One rainy afternoon, he invited her to a quiet gallery on the edge of the city. She nearly declined, worried about what it might mean. But something inside her wanted to see more of the world he lived in, not because she wanted to belong there, but because a part of her wanted to understand him, and in some small way maybe understand herself through him. The gallery was housed in a renovated warehouse with white walls and tall windows, and Ethan was waiting for her near the entrance, his hands tucked into his coat pockets as if to anchor himself there. Inside the gallery, the world faded into light and texture, soft colors stretching across the silence. Chloe moved slowly between the pieces, her eyes lingering on a sculpture made entirely of torn pages. He stepped beside her after a while, his voice quiet. "This one's called Memory Rebuilt." She asked him why he brought her here, and he shrugged like it was simple. "Because I thought you'd see more in it than I could, and I wanted to see it through you." That answer stayed with her longer than the art did. After the gallery, he offered to walk her to the train station, but they stopped at a quiet cafe tucked in a side street, where the lights were soft and the music barely there. They sat in the corner, and for a long time neither of them spoke. Finally, Chloe broke the silence, her voice low and cautious. "Do you ever feel like there are two different versions of your life running in parallel? The one people think you're living, and the one you're actually surviving?" Ethan looked at her and nodded without needing to ask for more. "Every day," he said. "My mother used to call it the difference between light and shadow. She said, we all have both, and most people spend their lives pretending the shadows don't exist." Chloe nodded slowly, her fingers curling around her mug. "Sometimes I think I've lived in shadow so long, I wouldn't know how to stand in the light without squinting." Ethan didn't try to correct her or comfort her. Instead, he said something she hadn't expected. "I know what it's like to feel unworthy of things that seem too big or too good or too kind, like love or safety or being seen, but I don't think that makes us broken. I think it just makes us human, and maybe it means we'll hold on tighter when we finally find it." Chloe didn't respond. Right away. Her throat tight with emotions she hadn't named yet. She didn't know what they were building, only that it wasn't fragile, and it wasn't pretend. It was careful and real and terrifying. That night, when she got home, she stood in front of the mirror for a long time, not looking at her face but at her eyes, trying to see what he saw when he looked at her with quiet reverence. She didn't feel beautiful in the traditional way. She felt ordinary, but Ethan never made her feel ordinary. He made her feel rare without ever saying it aloud, and that felt more dangerous than anything because it meant she had something to lose now. She started seeing him more outside of work, sometimes with excuses, like a book donation or a community grant meeting, and sometimes without any reason at all. He would call and ask if she had an hour to spare, and she'd find herself saying yes before thinking. They never kissed, never even touched beyond brief moments when their hands brushed or their arms bumped while walking. But the closeness felt deeper than physical, like a string connecting them quietly across rooms and weeks and fears. Then one evening he invited her to a private event his company was hosting. He said there would be donors and board members, and he didn't expect her to speak or network, just to be there with him, just to share the evening. Chloe hesitated, but eventually agreed. She borrowed a dress from a coworker, a simple navy piece that made her feel awkward until she saw the look on Ethan's face when she walked in. His expression softened, and he reached for her hand as if the room didn't exist. The event was held in a glass hall overlooking the bay. Chandeliers shimmered overhead, and waiters moved between guests with practiced grace. Chloe stayed near Ethan's side, quietly observing as he moved through the room with the calm confidence of someone used to power. But when he looked at her, it wasn't with detachment, it was with warmth, like she was the only person grounding him in the chaos. When they stepped outside onto the balcony for air, she asked him something she had kept buried. "Why me? Why are you always so kind to me?" Ethan didn't hesitate, because you don't expect it and because you don't ask for it, but you deserve it anyway. That answer cracked something inside her, a wall she hadn't realized was still up, and suddenly she found herself telling him about her grandmother, about the years of working and studying and keeping herself too busy to feel alone, about her decision to stay a virgin not out of fear, but because she wanted love to mean something. Ethan listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, but his gaze steady. When she finished, he took a breath and said, "Thank you for telling me that. I know that wasn't easy, but I want you to know that nothing you've said changes the way I see you. If anything, it makes me trust you more because it means you're real, and you've been fighting for yourself longer than most people ever will." They stood in silence after that, the city lights below them flickering like distant stars, and for the first time Chloe reached for his hand without thinking. Their fingers laced, and neither of them said anything else, because in that moment, words would only make the silence smaller, and the truth between them was already loud enough. The morning air was still and cold as Chloe stepped out of the library, her coat pulled tightly around her and her thoughts heavier than usual. The night before had shifted something between her and Ethan, something she wasn't sure how to define but couldn't deny. They hadn't kissed or confessed or said anything dramatic, but the way he had held her hand, the way he had looked at her, like she was something steady in a world too fast. It stayed with her like a warmth tucked beneath her ribs. The city moved around her as she walked, but she felt separate from it, like the ground had shifted slightly beneath her feet, and she was only just learning how to balance again. That afternoon, Ethan called and asked her to meet him at a site his company had just purchased. It was an old abandoned theater in the heart of the city, the kind of place that once hosted opera and now held only echoes and dust. When she arrived, he was already there, standing near the crumbling stage, his suit jacket off and his sleeves rolled up as he spoke with an architect. He waved her over and smiled, and the sight of him in that space, among ruins and plans, felt metaphorical in a way she didn't have the words for. They walked through the building slowly, his voice soft as he told her what they were hoping to turn it into: a cultural center, a place for music and art and literature, something for the community, something lasting. Chloe listened and nodded and asked questions, and somewhere between the broken rafters and dusty seats, she realized she was proud of him, not for the wealth or the power, but for the way he was using it, the way he seemed to carry the weight of something greater than himself. Afterward, they sat on the edge of the old stage, their feet dangling over the side and their shoulders barely touching. He looked at her and said something unexpected. "I used to think people like us would never meet in real life, like we lived in separate books on opposite shelves, and the only way our stories would ever touch was if someone forced them together." Chloe tilted her head and asked, "And now?" He smiled slightly and said, "Now, I think maybe some stories were just waiting for the right chapter." That night, they went to dinner for the first time. A real dinner, not coffee or a meeting or an excuse. A quiet, Italian place, with soft lights and older couples who spoke in low voices. Chloe wore a green dress she hadn't touched in years, and Ethan wore a tie she suspected he had chosen just for her. They talked about music and childhood and what they both wanted in 5 years, and when dessert came, neither of them touched it, too full on something else entirely. On the way home, he didn't ask to walk her back, and she didn't ask him to, but they moved together down the sidewalk like it was natural, like they had always done this. When they reached her building, they paused, and the silence stretched just long enough to feel like a choice. Chloe looked up at him and whispered, "I don't want to be afraid of this." And he stepped closer and whispered back, "Then don't be, because I'm not going anywhere." She kissed him before she could change her mind, soft and careful and real. And when he kissed her back, she felt the ground stop moving, felt the storm inside her quiet. It wasn't dramatic or perfect, but it was theirs, and that was enough. When they pulled apart, he pressed his forehead to hers and didn't say anything, because nothing needed to be said, not in that moment. The days that followed were slow and bright, their routines shifting gently to make space for each other. Sometimes he would pick her up from work with coffee and a tired smile. Sometimes she would bring him lunch at the office and stay just long enough to hear his laugh before slipping away again. They didn't announce what they were or define it, because they didn't need to. It was enough to know it existed, and it was growing. But peace never lasts forever, and just as quickly as their world had opened, it began to close again. One evening, Chloe arrived at Ethan's office to surprise him, a small bag of his favorite cookies in hand, and a smile she couldn't quite hide. But when she stepped off the elevator, something in the air felt wrong. The receptionist looked nervous, and Ethan's assistant wouldn't meet her eyes. She asked if he was in, and they nodded, but didn't speak, and the silence hit her like a chill. She knocked softly and entered. Ethan was seated behind his desk, his jaw tight and his eyes darker than usual. Across from him sat a man in a tailored suit. She didn't recognize, but immediately disliked. The man turned to her with a smile too sharp to be friendly and said, "You must be the girl." And Chloe froze, not at the words, but at the way Ethan's expression didn't change, didn't soften, didn't move. The man stood and offered his hand. Jonathan Reed, board member, investor, and friend to Ethan's late father. He said it like a challenge, like a test, and Chloe shook his hand because she didn't know what else to do. Ethan finally spoke, his voice low and controlled. Jonathan was just leaving, and the man laughed like they had shared a private joke. He glanced back at Chloe once more before walking out, his eyes lingering too long, and his smirk too knowing. When the door closed, Chloe turned to Ethan and asked, "What was that?" And he sighed and rubbed his temple and said, "Trouble." He didn't want to tell her everything at first, but she waited, quiet and still, until the words came. Jonathan had discovered their relationship and was threatening to use it against him, to accuse him of mixing business and personal affairs, of compromising company integrity, of violating terms that no one cared about until power was at stake. Ethan said he could handle it, but Chloe saw the tightness in his shoulders, the storm behind his eyes. She told him she didn't care, that she wasn't ashamed of what they were building, but he shook his head and said, "I do, not because I regret it, but because I won't let them use you to hurt me." Chloe didn't argue, not because she agreed, but because she understood. Power plays were nothing new, not in his world, but the way it made him pull away slowly, gently, like he was trying to protect her from his fire. That was new, and it hurt more than she expected. The days grew colder, and the space between them wider. Not in words, but in rhythm. Calls went unanswered longer, meetings postponed. She tried to be patient, to trust him, but trust was a muscle, and hers was tired. One evening she walked to the theater project alone, wanting to see the blueprints they had discussed, but instead she found it locked, lights off, and plans stalled. Ethan hadn't told her it was on hold, and that silence rang louder than anything. When she confronted him, he looked like he hadn't slept in days. He tried to explain that Jonathan had pulled funding, that the board was threatening to replace him, that every move was being watched and recorded, and she asked one question: "Do you still want me here?" And he didn't answer fast enough, so she left, not in anger, but in clarity, because she had learned to love with open hands, and she wouldn't cling to someone who couldn't reach back. For 3 weeks they didn't speak. She buried herself in work and books and memories, and he buried himself in meetings and silence and regret. Until one morning she received a package at her apartment. Inside was a single torn page from her favorite book, the words underlined in his handwriting: "Nothing worth keeping was ever held without cost." Beneath it was a plane ticket to a small town on the coast where the theater project had quietly resumed construction, and a note that read, "If you still believe in us, meet me at the place where stories begin." She stood at the edge of a choice, fear on one side and faith on the other, and this time she chose faith. The town was smaller than Chloe expected, and the air smelled of sea, salt, and wood smoke, as if the earth itself was trying to remind her of something older and quieter than the noise of the city. She stepped off the train with her heart thudding in her chest and the ticket still folded in her coat pocket, like a promise she had not yet decided to believe. The streets were cobblestone and lined with antique shops and cafes that looked like they belonged to another time. She followed the directions on the note he had sent, and after a short walk found herself standing in front of an old building with high arched windows and a sign that read, "The Avalon," in faded gold letters. It was the same name he had mentioned the night they stood on the stage of the ruined theater back in the city, the place where he said he first dreamed of building something that didn't just shine, but meant something. The doors were open, and inside the smell of fresh paint and sawdust hung in the air, like hope. The floor was unfinished, and scaffolding stretched toward the ceiling where stained glass panels cast colored light across the bare walls. Ethan stood near the far side speaking with a contractor. He wore a thick wool coat, and his hands were stuffed into his pockets, but when he turned and saw her, something in his face broke open. He didn't smile or run to her or speak right away. He just looked at her like she was something rare and unexpected, like the air had changed and only he could feel it. She walked toward him slowly, and when they stood in front of each other, the silence held everything they needed to say. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded blueprint, then laid it across a stack of crates and pointed to a corner of the design. "This will be the reading room," he said, "and here's the stage and the art gallery. And this," he paused and looked at her, "this is your clinic. A real one. Small but free. It's already approved and the permits are signed. I wanted you to see it before I started building it." Chloe stared at the space on the paper and then back at him, her voice barely a whisper. "You did this without knowing if I'd come," and he nodded and said, "I had to, because believing in something isn't supposed to be safe, it's supposed to be true." She looked around the empty building and then back at him, and for the first time in weeks, she felt like she could breathe again, like she had been holding her breath without realizing it. And now everything inside her was rushing back. Ethan stepped closer and said, "I never stopped wanting you here. I just didn't know how to keep you safe from everything around me." Chloe looked at him and said, "I didn't need to be protected. I needed to be trusted." He reached for her hand then, slowly, like he wasn't sure if he was allowed, and she let him take it because there was nothing left to fear. They walked through the space together as workers hammered and painted and shaped what would soon become something new. Ethan pointed out every room he had designed with her in mind, every line he had drawn not just for the sake of the community, but because of the way she had changed the way he saw everything. And as they moved through the building, Chloe felt something settle inside her, something soft and strong like certainty. When they reached the upstairs office he had reserved for meetings and quiet planning, she paused and looked at him. Why this place? Why not finish the city project first? And he said, "Because this town doesn't care who your father was or how much money you have. They care about what you give back." And I needed to remember what that felt like. That night they walked along the beach, the moon hanging low over the water and the sand cold beneath their feet. Ethan told her about his childhood, about the pressure of growing up under a father who believed success was measured in silence and numbers, about the night he decided to leave everything behind and build something that mattered. Chloe told him about her grandmother, about the evenings spent reading by candlelight, and the way stories had always felt like both escape and anchor. They shared truths, not to fix each other but to understand each other, and somewhere in the middle of a sentence he kissed her, not out of desperation or timing, but because it was time, because everything had been leading to this. The days that followed were a blur of blueprints and laughter and long conversations over coffee. They slept in the guest house behind the construction site, simple and small, but filled with something warm. They didn't define it because it didn't need a name. It just was. One afternoon, as the sky turned gray and the sound of waves rolled in from the bay, Chloe stood near the window watching workers unload wood and tile. Ethan walked in behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, his voice soft against her ear. "This is the part where we stop pretending." She turned in his arms and looked at him, her voice steady. "I stopped pretending the day you looked at me like I was more than a girl, from the wrong side of the city. But just as everything began to feel safe again, the past found a way to reach forward. Late one evening, a black SUV pulled up outside the construction site, and a man in a dark coat stepped out. Ethan tensed the moment he saw him, and Chloe knew instinctively that this was the storm he had been bracing for. The man introduced himself as Daniel Cross, a legal consultant from the Sullivan Group, sent by the board to inform Ethan that the company was under review. Apparently, Jonathan Reed had filed a formal complaint accusing Ethan of misusing corporate funds and forging permits, all of which was false, but the investigation had already begun. Ethan listened in silence, then asked Chloe to wait inside while he walked the site with Daniel, but Chloe didn't wait. She followed from a distance and heard just enough to know that if the board succeeded, the entire project would be frozen, the funding pulled, and Ethan removed from leadership entirely. When he returned to the guest house, she confronted him, her voice shaking. "Why didn't you tell me it was this bad?" And he looked exhausted when he said, "Because I didn't want you to think I failed you." She took his face in her hands and said, "I didn't fall in love with you because you're perfect. I fell in love with you because you kept choosing to be good when it would be easier to give up." They spent the night gathering evidence, writing statements, preparing documents. Chloe called in every favor she had from her college professors and nonprofit contacts. Ethan reached out to the staff who had worked with him since day one. The next morning they held a video conference with the board and laid out everything, not just the plans, but the proof, not just the numbers, but the stories. And when they finished, Ethan looked directly into the camera and said, "If you take this from me, then I'll start over somewhere else. because I didn't build this for your approval. I built it for the people who don't get asked what they need." There was silence, and then finally, the board voted. The motion to remove Ethan was denied, the project reinstated, the funding safe. Chloe watched as he closed his laptop and buried his face in his hands. She crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him, whispering, "It's over." But they both knew it was only just beginning. That night, they sat by the fireplace in the guest house, the flames casting shadows across the walls. Ethan took out a small velvet box and placed it between them. "I bought this before the board ever knew about us. I didn't want it to be because of pressure or time or drama. I just wanted it to be real." Chloe looked at the ring inside, simple and elegant. And hers? She didn't need to ask questions. She just said, "Yes," because there was no other answer. They kissed then, not out of relief but out of certainty, because they had faced fire and fear and found something worth keeping. And that night, as they lay in bed, listening to the wind sweep across the bay, Chloe thought about the night she had taken that shot of tequila, how she had woken up stripped of more than just clothes, stripped of walls and fear and certainty, and how she had walked straight into the heart of something that didn't care where she came from, only where she was willing to go next. The sun broke gently over the town, casting golden light across the roofs and the water beyond, and in the quiet of the morning, Chloe woke to the sound of Ethan's steady breath beside her, his arm draped loosely across her waist, their bodies still tangled beneath the soft quilt of the guest-house bed. There was a strange comfort in waking up like this, without alarm clocks or urgency, without the fear of uncertainty that used to sit at the edge of her chest each time she opened her eyes. Now there was just this, light and warmth and a steady rhythm that said, "We are here, and we made it." She lay still for a while, letting herself trace the path that had brought her here, from the night at the bar with that one innocent dare, to the awkward moment in the elevator, to the nights filled with hesitation and hope and kisses that felt like beginnings. There was so much that could have gone wrong, so many chances she had to walk away or turn back, but she hadn't, and neither had he. That was what made it all feel real, not the ring or the plans or even the building they were about to raise together, but the choices, small and brave and constant. Ethan stirred, his lips brushing against her shoulder as he murmured her name, soft and tired and full of something tender. She turned to face him, and he smiled, still half asleep. "Morning," he said, and she smiled back and whispered, "It is now." They stayed like that for a while, speaking in fragments and touches, until the sound of footsteps outside the window reminded them that the world still waited, that even in love there were responsibilities and promises, and people depending on them. Later that morning they visited the site together, hand in hand, their shadows long on the gravel path leading to the newly laid foundation. Workers nodded and smiled and offered greetings that felt warmer than usual, not because of who Ethan was, but because of what they saw when they looked at the two of them, something that didn't need a title to be understood, something that carried its own quiet power. Chloe helped carry boxes of supplies, reviewed volunteer schedules, and spoke with a local nurse who would be part of the clinic's staff. And as she moved through the work with purpose and grace, Ethan watched her from a distance, thinking not for the first time that he hadn't found a woman to complete his life. He'd found one who gave it meaning. That evening, a small celebration was held at the community hall, not an official launch, but a gathering of the people who had helped, who believed in the dream Ethan had brought to their quiet town. There was food and music and laughter that filled the walls. Chloe stood near the punch table talking with a young couple who planned to bring their child to the new pediatric wing. Once it opened, their story was simple: a job lost, insurance denied, and a daughter with chronic asthma who needed consistent care. They spoke of how the clinic would change everything for them, and Chloe listened with tears in her eyes, not because it was sad, but because it was proof, real proof that love could ripple outward into the world and leave something that lasted. When Ethan took the small stage to speak, the room quieted, and for a moment he just looked around as if trying to hold it all in. "Thank you for believing," he began, "not just in me, but in something bigger than me. This project was never just about buildings. It was about people, about stories that deserve to be heard, and lives that deserve to be lived without fear." And then he turned slightly and looked at Chloe, his voice catching just enough to make her chest ache. "And for me, it's always been about her. The one who saw me not for what I had, but for what I could be, who reminded me that sometimes the most valuable things can't be bought, only earned." The room broke into quiet applause, and Chloe felt every heartbeat in her body align with the look he gave her. Afterward, they slipped away from the crowd, walking toward the dock where fishing boats swayed gently in the tide. The air was crisp and the moon high and full. Chloe leaned against the railing and closed her eyes, listening to the sound of the water and his footsteps beside her. When she turned, he was holding a small lantern he had borrowed from the hall, and in his other hand was a sheet of parchment folded neatly in half. She raised an eyebrow in curiosity, and he said, "It's a letter from my mother." Chloe blinked, surprised, and Ethan explained that he had found it in a safe deposit box just weeks ago, unopened until now. The envelope was addressed to him in her handwriting, and inside was a single page that read, "My dearest Ethan, if you are reading this, then you've reached the moment where everything you thought mattered no longer does. I always hoped you'd find something real, something that had nothing to do with names or titles or stocks or boardrooms, something like the sound of laughter in a room full of strangers who become family, or the feeling of waking up next to someone who makes the air feel warmer. I know I pushed you to build something that would last, but what I meant was this: not walls and contracts, but love, real love, the kind that doesn't ask where you came from, but wants to know where you're going. Find that and follow it, and let the rest be noise." Chloe read the words slowly and then again, and when she looked up, Ethan was watching her with something bright and raw in his eyes. She didn't speak because there was nothing to add, just the sound of the water and the truth of what they had found. He stepped closer and said, "I used to think love like this was a fantasy, something that happened in movies or books, something that wasn't meant for people like me." And she smiled and said, "And I used to think it only belonged to people like you, and now we know it belongs to anyone who dares to hold on to it." They didn't kiss then. They didn't need to. It was enough to stand there, close and silent and still, letting the world move around them while they stayed anchored to each other. When they returned to the guest house, Chloe unpacked her notebook and began drafting the first outline for the clinic's educational outreach program. Ethan sat beside her reviewing construction costs and timelines, their work intertwined like their lives, full of purpose and trust and something deeper than ambition. In the days that followed, the foundation grew, not just for the building, but for the life they were building together. People from nearby towns came to offer help, volunteers signed up, donations came through quietly from those who believed in what was being done, not because of press releases or marketing campaigns, but because of whispered conversations, because kindness still traveled in quiet waves. Eventually, the hospital in the city reopened as well, with new staff and a renewed mission, and Chloe visited it with Ethan by her side, walking the polished halls with a different kind of pride, not the pride of arrival, but the pride of transformation. She no longer felt like the girl who had walked through those doors with shaky hands and dreams too big for her salary. Now she was the woman who had made something impossible real. As the story of their journey began to spread, they were offered interviews and features and opportunities to speak at conferences, but they turned most of them down, choosing instead to remain focused on the work, on the people, on the quiet everyday moments that had always meant the most. Because in the end, it wasn't about recognition or applause. It was about standing side by side and knowing they had chosen each other every single day. One quiet evening, as they sat in the guest house, watching the last light fade from the sky, Ethan turned to Chloe and said, "I used to think our lives were drawn in different colors, that no matter how close we came, we'd always be separated by the lines the world drew between us. But now I think love was always the eraser, the thing that made the lines disappear. Chloe nodded and rested her head on his shoulder and said, "Love isn't about erasing who we are. It's about choosing to see past what we've been told we're allowed to be." And in that simple truth, with no grand ceremony or music or declarations, they sealed something stronger than any contract, something richer than any fortune. They sealed the life they had built, one layer at a time, not on wealth or legacy, but on love, on choice, on the quiet courage of believing in each other,